We will move on to our next presenter. If just get my stuff sorted here. Our next presenter is Uwe Gramann. Uwe is a meteorologist with RWDI, very familiar to our community. Uwe is going to talk about meteograms and a bit about XT-grams, I think. Uwe is based in Smithers, and I think he's all queued up and ready to go. So, Uwe, if you're ready, I'll hand it over to you.
All right. Just audio and
Coming
video
through.
check.
Both are excellent. I'll
Okay.
get out of your way and you can share the goodness.
Joe. Okay, yeah, you can see, okay, as far as I can see, you guys can see my major, the front screen here, pattern recognition and meteograms. Thank you so much, Joe. If you guys have been taking weather course a while back, you will probably have noticed that in the weather course itself, you are being introduced to a whole range of tools. And if you have followed sort of the industry, how it has developed over the last few years, you may have noticed a trend that has gone away from the more classical tools and focusing a lot more on the meteograms. And I know from several other meteorologists as well that we are of the opinion that meteograms are really cool and great and a wonderful one-stop shop type of idea, but they don't give you, unfortunately, the whole picture. And that's why the weather course is teaching a whole bunch of other tools. So instead of going all Rumpelstilzchen on you guys and become frustrated with that the meteogram is pretty much the only go-to tool that is being used in a lot of applications, I wanted to use this opportunity here in this talk, and so thank you very much for the Avalanche Association to give me this opportunity to perhaps help a little bit with experience to show what pattern recognition can add to your interpretation of the weather patterns that are coming down the pipe in a meteogram. So for you guys, essentially, to get the most out of the meteogram instead of saying that you should use other tools and all that kind of stuff. So why would we want to do that? Essentially, there is a whole bunch of reasons why meteograms or pattern recognition in meteograms will improve drastically a decision-making process for whatever it is that you want to decide upon. But I also want to point out, in a lot of the courses that I have taught, I have recognized that there some people don't like necessarily that extreme left brain approach from weather forecasting. It's a lot of numerical stuff. It's a lot. It looks mathematical. This pattern recognition is very right brain. Is very intuitive and can be done by all of those. If you have ever not liked meteorology or those meteograms, try to listen to this one here. Maybe this will spark a little bit more interest. Things like here on the screen here on the right hand side, if you can spot the omega, the Greek omega letter here in that actual panel, in the 500 hectopascal panel, then you know sort of what pattern recognition is. And I think just from that recognition alone, you can make some fairly significant deductions over about what the weather will do in the next in this particular case, in the next several days even. Don't be completely frustrated though initially. It takes a little bit of practice, and I would encourage you to talk with those around you that have perhaps more experience with a particular meteogram that you are using. And with all of that, I also want to highlight here when I'm going into the overview slide here, I'm using obviously some meteograms that I have particularly easy access to. I use a lot of the examples here. But at the same time, meteograms, or how I often refer to them as XT diagrams, are available from a whole bunch of different sources, and everything I'm talking about applies to, well, certainly most of the meteograms, if not all of them. Most of it applies actually to all of them. And so just because it looks one way here, it could potentially look very similar in a meteogram that is being provided by others. So anyway, what I'm really talking about here is I want to start fairly slow, but then pull up quite nicely. First with single parameters, so that we're essentially looking at only one of those panels and check out what is actually happening as sort of as the line goes. And then we're looking at multiple parameters, so that you actually have to move vertically. You discern essentially one trend in one panel, and then you have to move up and essentially explain or support that pattern with a pattern in a secondary panel higher up or further down. And also notice that multiple parameters, of course, can show up in one particular panel, or also be overlaid. Then that makes it a little bit more tricky. That then goes under point number 3 here. But let's start with a very simple stuff here, basic meteogram patterns, what to look for. So just making sure that we're getting here on the same page. And I realize that the video has to catch up here a little bit. Let's give it some time. Here it is, I hope. Meteogram, so in all meteograms that I know, all XT diagrams, time progresses from left to right, and the value itself becomes higher from the bottom to the top. So I think that should be fairly intuitive already right there. So in a case like this one here, you essentially have now a value, let's call it for now just pressure, just to make it as an example, but it obviously applies to anything. Pressure increases gradually in time as you're moving forward over that particular period. But or you can move it the other way around. Of course, if you're moving from top left to the bottom right, in this case, if it is still pressure, it would be decreasing pressure, fairly gradual as you move onward in time. And of course, if it were temperature, same type of idea there. What is important in pattern recognition is very often the very last point here that I'm trying to make is the lack of trend, what is not happening. And so if you're looking at a trend that you see in front of here like this, it's actually quite too ideal, if you will. It's a fairly benign decrease in pressure or benign decrease in temperature. And if this were now, let's say, over a 3-day period, there is actually a lot of stuff not happening in here. So it's fairly benign, fairly slow decreasing. There are no wobbles in here. There's nothing really too varying, if you will, except for the gradual decline of the value. So for all intents and purposes, from a weather pattern perspective, this all can be described as one single pattern that decreases over time, as opposed to this next one that I want to show up now. Here's a decrease, and I essentially now have thrown in between a drastically more intense decrease, and that now suddenly subdivides, if you will, the entire meteogram. So not just this particular panel, be it temperature or pressure, but the entire meteogram is now actually subdividable in 3 different time periods. And so pattern 1, essentially slight, benign decrease, a little bit boring, getting cooler or whatever it is, fair enough. The same thing happening over in pattern number 3. But the really interesting part is now happening right in between in number 2, where things happen very quickly. So in any pattern recognition, you may want to pay attention where curves become very steep. That is usually something where weather things happen. They may or may not impact you, but from a weather perspective, those are usually the times where, or the periods where fronts are located and where things are happening, where wind shifts are happening, where clouds are breaking up, that kind of stuff. And just in your brain, or from a communication perspective, if you want to communicate this forecast then to your pilots or to your avalanche technicians or what have you, you can now subdivide your time period of the entire 3 days that are coming down the road or whatever it is in these 3 particular patterns. Last, but certainly not least, beware of the flat line. The flat line is very important, but and very, very frequently underestimated and what it can do. Being a little bit flippant here, the best case scenario in a flat line, when you see a lot of flat lines in meteograms, is essentially you look out the window, and if you're at the very beginning of that flat line here, what you see is what you get over the entire time period. So when you don't get a flat line, you want to explain why that is, and you want to pay attention to that. So also be aware that a flat line is not something that contains no information. Quite on the contrary, it can be quite an indicator. And so, for example, in a case like this here, again, I just wanted to show that the flat line essentially delineates, in this case, pattern number 1. And pattern number 2, where now things start going up and down again, it would be the secondary pattern in this case. So the way you would use this, for example, is if pattern 2, let's say this is temperature, and what you see here on pattern 2 is actually a diurnal variation with temperature going up and down. Pattern 1 obviously doesn't have that. So you're now separating essentially a non-diurnal temperature trend from a diurnal temperature trend. And chances are, this is obviously made up, but chances are pattern 1 is actually a trend that has been caused by some kind of a cloudiness. So solar radiation is not here. So suddenly you realize the pattern 1, a flatline trend in temperature, may actually signify the presence of clouds and therefore winds and potentially some frontal issues, what have you. Just pointing out that a flat line is not necessarily no information. Then otherwise, just quickly jumping ahead here to the diurnal variation from a temperature perspective, that is, or not just temperature perspective, from a meteogram perspective in general, I would say, but in temperature just in particular, the diurnal variation is one of the most important patterns you should recognize, I think, over time, and especially you can see a perfect diurnal variation in temperature shows a fairly steep increase in temperature in the morning. Let's say it's a cloudless day. Temperature comes up really nice and steep and then flat lines more and more towards the actual peak. Once then the solar radiation starts going down, or a little bit after that, the temperature also starts coming down relatively steep again and then flat lines again towards the actual overnight low. So this kind of it almost looks a little bit like a wave. The reason why I'm pointing this out is in this next picture here, this is actually an actual meteogram, very benign high pressure situation, high solar output. I hope that the screen will catch up. Here it is. You can see in the yellow line up here, solar radiation going very, very high up, going down to 0 overnight, going very, very high up, showing a very nice steep increase, flatlining, and then decrease, and then flatlining towards the end. That's a perfect example, but the point here is not necessarily the diurnal pattern in itself. The point here is to recognize when that diurnal pattern is interrupted, as you see, for example, over here with this tiny little bit of a dot. This particular example is very weak, but such an interruption that you see in the diurnal panel has to be caused by something. In this particular case, it was just a little bit of a cloud blob up at 5 kilometer or 10 kilometer height. But you recognize the point here. If you know what a good diurnal pattern looks like, you will recognize when that pattern doesn't exist. And as a result, you may want to ask questions and say, well, how come this is not happening? Is this something that I should pay attention to? And going over to the second most important pattern that you should recognize, that is from pressure, from a pressure trend. Also recognize that in the transition seasons and certainly in the summer season, the pressure will also show a sort of a diurnal undulation, like you see here in the bottom of those diagrams, a diurnal undulation of the pressure itself that comes from essentially pressure being reduced during the daytime by hotter temperatures. That makes things a little bit more difficult if you want to find other parameters. Usually up here in Canada, we're somewhat lucky. Obviously in the winter, I think most areas are lucky because snow means cold temperatures, and cold temperatures usually means that we don't have too much of a diurnal variation of the pressure associated with it. So this diurnal pressure variation is not something that you would see usually in the winter time when the solar is just very low. But this diurnal variation of the pressure trend is overlaid in this particular case here by a much more important point. That's the pressure dip. So the pressure dip is a locally low dip in the pressure trace, and especially followed by a strong increase in pressure. So if you have, like in the top diagram here, a pressure line that goes low, 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 and then suddenly drastically goes back up, you essentially have what I would call the pressure dip in this particular case that very often points you to the very moment of a frontal passage. Any front is sitting in a low pressure system embedded and is displaying itself, if it is a well-defined front, in a pressure dip. And behind the front, when the pressure starts increasing again, that's where you see that sort of increase here. So if you take one thing out of this entire presentation, take the pressure dip out of it, because it delineates the timing of the pressure of the frontal passage down to the hour. That depends on the time resolution of your particular meteogram that you're using. And in a case like in the lower diagram, if you were to select the strongest and lowest pressure dip, obviously I gave it now away, this is the point that you're looking for, and you know that in there something has to happen. Or something has to be explained. How come that the pressure is suddenly that low? And chances are that you're actually going to find a frontal passage right at that particular point here. So with that, let's move into another panel. In the XT diagrams, you probably have seen something similar in the upper panel, where actually the vertical value is now height. It's not the actual value of temperature or pressure anymore. It is now height. And as a result, the actual lines, the isotherms and isotax, etc., now have to have actually a value associated with it. Looks a little bit different, but the pattern is the exact same thing. You're looking at a decrease from top left to bottom right, and therefore a cooling of temperatures. And you can also now, this is now in black and white, but you can also obviously color that in, and therefore look at a rainbow type of contour. Again, the same idea as with the with a timeline in a single parameter diagram. If the stronger the decrease is or increase, so the steeper the lines are, the more interesting they become from a weather perspective. But now let's go over to a much more interesting display. The moisture, or if you will, cloud, that is displayed in such a vertical diagram. And first of all, when you see something like that in front of you, it would be a very good idea to just simply look at this as three areas. Pattern 1, no cloud. Pattern 2, some cloud. Pattern 3, no cloud. There's already your pattern recognition right there. But if you look at that a little bit more in detail, and let's say you are a person that is high up, let's say somewhere, I don't know, you're in, I don't know, top of a mountain, 4,000 meters high or something. You are at the upper blue line in this particular diagram here. As time progresses from left to right, you will actually see the moisture increase, some clouds at about 2.5, way earlier than a person that is lower down, let's say in alpine or even valley terrain, where at the point 2.5 or 3, there is no cloud yet. But that lower person will already obviously see the clouds high up. And as a result, also, of course, on the other side, as you're exiting the clouds, you high up will exit the clouds quite a bit earlier than the person down here. In fact, you will exit, in this particular case, you will exit the clouds as the lower person is still full bore in the very high intense cloud. Also notice that, of course, now here the intensity of this particular phenomenon, whatever it is fairly limited up high, but down below it is fairly intense. So chances are what you see here, so high clouds first coming in, then lower clouds, and then a strong intensity of the cloudiness down low, is actually a warm front. It's a very typical scenario. If you see such a top left to bottom right slanting of a cloud feature at the beginning and the end, that is most likely what you are looking at. So let's try to put all of this together in just a fairly quick diagram here, just to end this talk with some examples in a more complex scenario. First of all, on the left side, let's just look at the left diagram here alone. First thing that you can look at is the pressure trace, and you look for the pressure dip. So that is, like I said, most important. Bang, down here is your pressure dip. Again, it's the lowest point followed by a fairly good increase. Then let's take, just for the sake of it, because we just discussed it, let's look at the temperature pattern here. Undulation, diurnal, almost perfect. Then it becomes a little cruddled up, not all that great. And then not flatlining, but essentially not showing a diurnal trend, still going up, and then resulting again into a diurnal trend. So if I just look at the diurnal trend, I see pattern 1 over here, diurnal trend, then flatlining essentially, and followed by a diurnal trend again afterwards. And notice that the flatlining that or almost flatlining here, that I indicated before, most likely has something to do with clouds, is now reflected in the uppermost panel. A lot of cloud, there's your moisture blob up here. Also notice, it is also slanted top left to bottom right. It doesn't look all that great in this particular meteogram here, but if you're looking at it, it is almost a 12-hour delay, all the way from high up, all the way down to the bottom. So keep in mind, this one here is also first, this particular front here that shows up is first showing up at height, and then is showing up down at the surface. And then, of course, you will see all the regular things, precipitation and falling out of the cloud. And then the pressure dip down here is nicely correlated with winds change. The winds are not all that strong, but you can nicely see here in that particular trace how the southwesterly is now switching to northwesterly winds. That is also showing up in the lower level winds as well. So there's overall your frontal system. One other thing that I can also point out here is the slant of the isotherms up here is essentially slightly increasing, becoming steeper over here. The thick one here, the thick pink one here, is a really nice one that is essentially almost flatlining and shooting up quite strongly. So the front up in the higher elevations is still located right here, whereas the front at the surface is essentially located right down here. So you can also see the slant of the front in particular here, sort of moving first from the higher elevations, then down, further down below. Moving over to the right diagram, you see the exact same thing. Again, there's your pressure dip down here, strong changes in wind speed change. Also before the pressure dip, the actual frontal precipitation moving through. The slant of that blob in the upper panel, now not all that well displayed, but really, really nicely you can see in the isotherms flatlining, followed by a steep decrease and cooling, and then followed by another period of essentially flatlining. And yeah, so there's your most important pattern recognition. And before I end it, I'll show you one last one here very quickly. Inversions, the pattern to recognize here in the upper panels in the isotherms is this, what I call sometimes a little bit of a goose egg that shows warm temperatures centered right in the center of whatever goose egg you have. Notice in the right panel here, which is, by the way, the same high pressure ridge causing that inversion, just at a different location. Not as perfectly shown, but also a nice little goose egg. And in this particular case, the inversion actually extends a little bit higher up. You see that it is an inversion by simply going from the very, very low levels. Look at how you're looking at about -10 or -12 degrees. You move higher up. You're going now to -10, -5, perhaps -8, something like that. And then moving back, sorry, -2 or -3 in the center here. And then moving back down to -5, -10. So you see there is a high, a warm core, not necessarily above freezing, but that could happen as well. And in the right panel, this particular core, warm core, is moving a little bit higher enough so that the temperature difference between 700 and 850 hectopascal actually shows a strong inversion here in those yellow bars. That's unique only to this particular diagram here, but for all intents and purposes, it's something that you can see quite nicely. Also in an inversion, of course, if it is happening, if it is coinciding with an Arctic outbreak or a strong high pressure ridge, the surface pressure here again, very, very high up. So 1036 is fairly significant high pressure, and on the left side here also anything that is sort of above 1025, I would consider that definitely high pressure. So there you have it, pressure dip, diurnal variation, frontal passages, and the inversion. And those are my quick little recommendations here for some pattern recognition in meteograms. If you have any questions, let me know.
Great, thanks, Uwe. I've seen some people drop questions into the question box. Our preference is for you to use the hands up feature and ask. Brent, do we have anyone lined up to ask Uwe a question?
Yes, we have Brian Golds up first with questions.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yep,
go ahead.
I can hear you, Brian. Hi.
Hey, awesome review. Hey, good to see you. Hey, just wondered if you had any comment on the reduction in air traffic these days and how that plays out in the Meteogram. Which parameters is it impacting most and things like that?
Yeah, the information that I have is about well, 2.5 weeks old, something like that. But I have noticed some I guess public service releases by European, but also Canadian governments, and Matt is online. He can probably also comment later. But the traffic definitely has decreased, and there is definitely some impact on weather models because they use that information in the analysis that goes into the actual numerical models. However, the highest value by far from these airplane observations is when they're going up and down towards the airports. And because we have a lot of duplication there at any major airport, you have any hour, any waking hour, you have dozens and dozens of vertical soundings. So it's quite redundant. And as a result, as long as we have just 2 or 3, per 6 hours type of idea, the weather models can deal with that quite nicely. So what the essential message was from the governments that I heard is impact, yes, big, no. So at this point, we have not seen any deterioration. It has to be researched then, of course, also after the fact, once we're hopefully, knocking on wood here, through this, how big it will become. But I have not heard of any measurable, particularly negative impact. Does that answer it?
Yeah, that's perfect. Thanks. Thanks, Eva.
We have another question from Jonas Hook.
Hi, Uwe.
Hey, Jonas.
Jonas Folk here from Golden. I'm just wondering if there's anywhere or any sources that you know of to look at weather forecasts or models that are historical, as you know, not long term, but maybe something that we could look at for the last week or whatever to sort of help train these pattern recognition abilities.
Sorry. Now you're asking for meteograms specifically, right? You're not asking for data in general. You're asking for meteograms in particular.
I guess that would be ideal. Yeah. Is that stuff lost immediately after it's produced, or?
Well, I can't speak in general. I would have to look into it. You know, the company that I work for that does not archive it. You can email me. That's why I put the screen up here again, and I can search a little bit more for you. I know that the University of Washington had some meteograms out there that, and I know they're much better with archiving. So that would be one thing I would look for. I'm not exactly sure if Environment Canada is archiving it. They're not displaying it publicly, the archive. It goes, well, some of them go a little bit back, but I think for all intents and purposes, you would have to essentially contact them and get it out. But I would be more than happy to dig a little bit more into it. My email is up on the screen here. I hope you can see that. Send me a reminder and I'll look a little bit more into it. There's a lot of archives for satellite imagery and that kind of stuff. Observations are easier to find, I should say. Meteograms, I would have to dig a little.
Cool, thanks.
Great. I don't see any more questions in the queue unless you do, Brent.
Nope, we're good to go. No more questions from the floor.
Okay,
Thank you,
well,
guys.
Uwe, thank you very much for that excellent presentation. Uwe's email is on the screen still, and I'm sure he welcomes questions there, as he said. We are going to try to abide time. Apologies, I was eager to get us back on time and probably rushed into Uwe's presentation. We know that some people are logging in on the hour, so we will return shortly at 10:30. A quick reminder to everyone that in terms of the way the GoToWebinar presents on your local machine, the more you can reduce other web apps and traffic on your end, the better the performance will be. I will step off and we will return at 10:30 on the dot with Laura McGuire. Okay, thanks everyone and see you soon.